Commander Alex Harlow stood before the expansive viewport of the space station, staring into the void. The stars beyond the glass twinkled in cold, indifferent silence, as if mocking his thoughts. The weight of the impending decision pressed down on him, heavier than any battle he had ever fought. In less than an hour, the Galactic Council would decide the fate of all humans. The fate of Earth. The fate of a species that had only begun to scratch the surface of the cosmos before being condemned to eternal imprisonment. He hadn't thought it would come to this, but now, standing at the precipice, Alex wondered if humanity even had a chance to survive the crushing weight of the Council's disdain. Next to him, Ambassador Olivia Mason adjusted her formal uniform, with shaky hands, trying in vain to mask her nervousness. She had been the one to deliver the diplomatic messages, to speak on behalf of humanity, yet today she felt like an outsider, caught between the two forces humanity's desperate fight, for freedom and the Council's unrelenting will to suppress. She couldn't hide the tremor in her voice as she spoke, her words barely above a whisper. "They've already made up their minds." "Alex," she said softly, her eyes reflecting the same helplessness he felt. "This trial, it's been nothing more than a show. They'll quarantine us, and no one will listen." Alex's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. His eyes never left the stars. He had lived through wars, seen battles that tore planets apart, but nothing had prepared him for this. The Council, the so-called protectors of the galaxy, had decided that humanity, with all its potential, was too chaotic, too dangerous. Their verdict had already been sealed in their minds. Earth would be locked away, its inhabitants forever confined to their home system, unable to leave. Olivia stepped closer, her eyes searching his face for some sign of reassurance, but there was none. He knew as well as she did that their voices would not be heard in the council chambers. The Zarian High Chancellor, Vortic, had already made up his mind. The Zarians, who had ruled the Galactic Council for over 10,000 years, did not tolerate new blood, especially those who thought differently, who questioned their rigid order. The council chamber was alive with alien voices, the hum of the gathered representatives rising and falling in a cacophony of different languages and tones. But none of them mattered. The Zarian High Chancellor sat at the head of the vast circular room, a towering figure with blue skin and 4 long, spindly arms that gestured with arrogance. His large eyes scanned the room with unmistakable disdain, settling on Alex and Olivia, as though they were nothing more than irritants to be swatted away. "The evidence against humanity is clear," Vortic's voice boomed, the words echoing in the chamber. "In just 3 centuries since discovering electricity, they have fought 2 world wars, split the atom for weapons, and nearly destroyed their own planet. Their music is chaotic, their art lacks form, and their politics are unstable. They are too unpredictable, too volatile. They are unworthy of the stars." Alex's fists clenched, but he said nothing. The Zarian was right in some ways. Humanity had been reckless, impulsive, and self-destructive. But they had also risen from the ashes time and again. They had rebuilt, reformed, and found new ways to survive. It was that very unpredictability that made them capable of greatness. A red-scaled alien stood to challenge the Chancellor's words, his voice carrying through the chamber. "But humans have shown remarkable ability to change. In the last 100 years, they've unified, they've advanced in medicine, and they've made efforts to cooperate globally. Isn't that worth considering?" Vortic scoffed, dismissing the red-scaled alien with a wave of his hand. "Their attempts at unity are too little, too late. They cannot be trusted with faster-than-light travel. Imagine them spreading their chaos across the galaxy. No, this decision is final." Olivia stepped forward, her voice steady despite the terror gnawing at her. "Respected members of the Council," she began, her words carrying the weight of 1,000 desperate pleas. Humanity has overcome many challenges. Yes, we've made mistakes, but we learn from them. We are a species of boundless potential. We offer more than just chaos. We offer fresh ideas, perspectives, and innovation that no one else can bring. To the galactic community, for a moment, there was silence. Some of the aliens in the room looked at her with uncertainty. Others exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable. But the Zarians, who had ruled the galaxy for millennia, were unmoved. This trial is a farce, Lord Expat. Your species will remain quarantined in your solar system. Any attempt to break free will trigger defensive measures. You have 1 month. After that, the barrier will be locked in place, and you will never leave. The room erupted in murmurs, but the decision was made. It was final. Back on Earth, the response was immediate. Governments that had spent years bickering and fighting over trivial matters were united for the first time in human history. The entire world mobilized in anger and defiance. Emergency meetings were held, speeches were made, but the sentiment was clear. Humanity would not be caged. Not now, not ever. Professor Frank Nichols sat in his laboratory at MIT, watching the announcement on the screen with a furrowed brow. Unlike the politicians shouting their anger, Frank was a man of science, and his mind worked differently. He didn't want to retaliate with more speeches or more weapons. Instead, he looked at the galaxy with fresh eyes, considering how he could bypass the Council's barrier, break through their technological chokehold as the energy barrier around. Earth hummed with alien power. Frank began his work, quietly studying theoretical physics, exploring new ways of bending space. He believed there was a path they hadn't considered a way for humanity to slip through their prison without the Council ever realizing it. Humanity had always found a way to fight back. This time, they would fight with knowledge. Meanwhile, Alex stood outside a secure meeting room, his thoughts clouded with frustration and helplessness. He had never imagined that humanity's future would come down to a single moment, a single decision. But now, that decision had been made. They were banished, and it was up to him, up to humanity's fighters, to make sure they would never stay imprisoned as the barrier loomed over Earth. Alex and Olivia shared a moment of silence, their thoughts heavy with what they knew was coming. The battle for humanity's freedom had just begun, and they would not go quietly. The days that followed the Council's decision felt like an endless void, a silent waiting room between one life and another. On Earth, there was an unspoken sense of unity in the air, a shared understanding that the world could never go back to what it was before the barrier. But unity was not enough. It would take more than speeches and protests to break the chains that the Galactic Council had placed around humanity. Professor Frank Nichols continued his work in the secrecy of his lab at MIT, poring over equations and concepts that most would dismiss as impossible. Unlike the politicians who raged and blamed, Frank believed there was a way through. The barrier that encased Earth was not just a wall of energy. It was a system built on the Council's own understanding of physics. But the Council had made a fatal mistake. They had stopped looking for alternatives. They had become complacent, stagnant in their power, believing their technology to be flawless. Frank's eyes glowed with the quiet fervor of a man who knew the truth. There was always a way. He began to work day and night on his research, pushing the boundaries of theoretical physics. He was no longer simply trying to understand the forces that governed the galaxy. He was trying to bend them to humanity's will. He had a breakthrough in mind, the phase shift drive. Rather than folding space like the Council's ships, Frank theorized that humanity could shift its ships out of phase with normal spacetime, an idea so far beyond the Council's technology that it was virtually undetectable. It was risky. The technology had never been tested, and there was a good chance it wouldn't work. But for Frank, it was humanity's only hope. He needed time, and time was something he didn't have. A council's monitoring stations were already in place, watching Earth's every move, waiting for any sign of rebellion. He couldn't let them catch wind of his plans. Meanwhile, General Lara Harding sat in a dark room, watching Frank's progress with cautious optimism. As a military leader, she had seen enough war to know that victories were won through surprise, through quick and calculated moves. But now, she was faced with a new kind of war. A war that wouldn't be fought with guns and bombs, but with ideas, with innovation, and with the patience to build something no one else had considered. Lavra had spent her life preparing for battles on the ground, organizing troops, and leading them into combat. But this was different. Humanity wasn't simply fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for their place in the galaxy. There's no time to waste, she muttered under her breath, looking out over the sprawling city skyline. The Council had underestimated humanity's capacity to innovate, and that, she believed, would be their undoing. Across the world, the seeds of resistance began to sprout. Governments, once divided by borders and political ideologies, began to cooperate. Scientists and engineers rallied to Frank's cause, pouring resources into a secretive, high-risk mission to develop the phase shift drive. Military leaders like General Harding began to recruit the brightest minds, preparing them for what would come next. But in the midst of the frenzy, there was a quiet desperation. Humanity had always been a species that fought for survival, but this time it was different. The stakes were higher. If Frank's calculations were wrong, the entire project could fail, leaving Earth forever trapped in the grip of the Galactic Council. Commander Alex Harlow, meanwhile, found himself caught in the storm of these new developments. He had always been a soldier, a man of action, but now, more than ever, he felt the weight of his role as a leader. The resistance needed a figurehead, someone to guide them through the coming trials. But Alex was not so sure of his place in this battle. The weight of humanity's fate felt unbearable, and the constant pressure of leading a rebellion was taking its toll on him. His hands were stained with the blood of past conflicts, and he was unsure whether the future he fought for was worth the sacrifices that lay ahead. His moments of self-doubt were brief, fleeting, but they were there, gnawing at him, reminding him that leadership was a lonely, uncertain path. One night, as Alex walked through the corridors of the hidden facility where the phase shift drive was being developed, he stopped to watch Frank and his team at work. Frank looked up, noticing Alex's presence. "You're still here," Alex remarked, his voice carrying the fatigue of someone who hadn't slept in days. Frank smiled, though it was weary. "We don't have much time, Commander. The barrier is closing in on us. If we don't get this working, humanity is done." Alex nodded, his eyes meeting Frank's. "I don't think we'll let that happen." In that moment, something shifted within Alex. It wasn't just the weight of the Council's decree that held him captive. It was the weight of possibility. If Frank's theory worked, if they could break through the barrier, then the fight wouldn't just be for survival. It would be for something greater. Humanity would prove the Council wrong. They would prove they were capable of more than the Council could ever imagine. "We'll need to keep this quiet," Frank added, his tone grave. "If they catch wind of what we're doing, we won't just be quarantined. They'll come for us. They'll destroy us." Alex's expression hardened. "Then we'll have to make sure they never find out." The stakes were now clear. Humanity's fight for freedom would not just be a struggle for survival. It would be a battle for the future of the galaxy itself. If the phase shift drive worked, humanity would have the power to change the balance of power in the galaxy forever. But for now, there was only the quiet hum of machines and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. All they could do was work in secret, trusting that the human spirit could find a way to break through the barriers that had been placed in their path. And deep within the heart of humanity's secret resistance, one question lingered in the air. What would they do when the barrier came down? The answer, though still uncertain, would be a new beginning. A beginning that would defy the very forces that thought they could control humanity's destiny. The weeks that followed were a blur of constant motion designs, tests, failures, and breakthroughs. Commander Alex Harlow threw himself into the heart of humanity's quiet war, directing operations and keeping the resistance scattered across the globe in line. Each day, Frank Nichols and his team worked tirelessly in secret, tweaking and refining. The phase shift drive, inching closer to a breakthrough that could change the course of the galaxy. The resistance was becoming a machine, moving quietly, strategically, but always with a sense of urgency that hung in the air like a storm. Alex often found himself at the heart of the operations, overseeing everything from logistics to training, while occasionally sneaking a moment to check on Frank's progress. Every time he stepped into the laboratory, the tension was palpable. It was a place of brilliant minds and frayed nerves, where the weight of humanity's future rested on the shoulders of those working late into the night. Everything's in place, Frank said one evening, his voice steady but with a hint of exhaustion, as he leaned over a holographic display showing the final design of the phase shift drive. His hand moved across the screen, adjusting quantum readings and power. Flow algorithms. I don't care if we make history or not, Frank muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. Just get me a working prototype, and we'll see if we have a shot at surviving this. Alex stood beside him, his arms crossed, his eyes scanning the simulation data. Do you think it'll work? He asked, the question weighing on him more than he cared to admit. Frank didn't respond immediately, instead focusing on the fluctuating readouts. If the math holds, it'll work. A theory's one thing, reality's another. We've been so focused on the barrier itself, we haven't stopped to think about how the Council might respond once they realize what we're capable of. They won't just sit back and let us escape. Alex's eyes narrowed. Then we'll make sure they never see us coming. We've already been underestimated. He turned toward the door, his mind already racing ahead to the next step. We can't afford failure, Frank. Not now, not ever. The room fell into a heavy silence. A pressure was mounting, but Alex knew there was no turning back. Every resource, every mind, every hand was now focused on one goal escaping the Council's grasp. If they succeeded, humanity would finally have the freedom to reach the stars. If they failed, well, Alex wasn't willing to entertain that thought. Not yet. It was time. The first test of the phase shift drive was scheduled. There was no more time for theory or endless simulations. The reality of their situation was too pressing. The barrier surrounding Earth was not just a technological barrier. It was a symbol of the Council's control, and humanity's defiance of it would be their first true strike against the Council's authority. Captain Daniel Frost, chosen for his skill and experience as a pilot, prepared for the test flight. He stood in the darkened hangar, running through his pre-flight checks. The ship was smaller than most of the vessels the Council used, designed for stealth and speed. Its sleek exterior absorbed light, rather than reflecting it, giving it the appearance of a shadow moving through the void. How are we looking, Captain? Frank's voice crackled over the intercom, cutting through the silence. All systems are nominal, Professor. The ship's ready for phase shift, Daniel replied, his voice calm and steady, betraying no hint of the weight he felt on his shoulders. The first successful test would mean everything, but failure, that was not an option. The moment came, and the tension in the air was unbearable. The countdown began. 3:02. 1. Daniel pressed the button, and the ship's engines hummed to life. The phase shift drive activated, and the world outside the hangar shifted in a way that defied all logic. The stars outside, once so distant, began to blur, taking on an unnatural, bluish hue as the ship phased out of sync with normal space-time. The reality of the barrier ahead loomed large, but as the ship sped toward it, it seemed almost surreal. The barrier shimmered in the distance, an impenetrable wall of energy that had held Earth captive for decades. For the first time, humanity was about to break free from their chains. The ship passed through the barrier. Nothing happened. The barrier shimmered around them, but did not activate. The ship continued to glide silently through the void, the control systems showing no signs of interference from the Council's energy field. Daniel took a deep breath, feeling a strange combination of exhilaration and disbelief. They were free. It worked. Daniel muttered to himself, barely able to believe it. Frank's voice came through again, louder now with a note of disbelief. "Can you see anything on your instruments? No sign of detection?" Daniel quickly checked the systems, his heart pounding in his chest. "Everything's clear. No alarms, no sign of the Council's ships. We've made it through." For the first time in months, Alex felt a surge of hope. The phase shift drive was a reality. Humanity was not trapped anymore. They had a way out. But even as the excitement buzzed through the team, they knew this was only the beginning. The Council was not blind. They would eventually catch on to the sudden anomaly of a human ship slipping past their barrier. And when they did, they would strike back with a vengeance. But for now, humanity had achieved the impossible. They had gained the edge they needed. "Get back here, Captain." General Harding's voice came through the comm, calm but firm. "One jump beyond the barrier, then return. We need to confirm this test before we proceed." Daniel nodded, though he felt a strange reluctance to turn around. They had crossed the threshold. They had touched the edge of a new world, one where humans weren't trapped by the limits of the Council's authority, but orders were. Orders. He would return, as planned, and make sure the technology was sound before they risked more. As the ship turned back toward the barrier, Daniel's mind wandered for a brief moment, imagining the countless possibilities that lay beyond. The stars. He thought of Earth, its people, the ones who had been told they would never be free. And now, for the first time, that was about to change. He had crossed the barrier once, and now humanity had the power to do it again. The battle had just begun, and they were no longer bound by the Council's cage. They were free, and the galaxy would learn just how dangerous humanity could be. The days that followed the successful test of the phase shift drive felt like an uneasy quiet before a storm. Humanity had taken its first bold step toward freedom, but the reality of what lay ahead was not lost on anyone. The Shadow Empire, as the Resistance had come to call themselves, was growing in numbers and ambition. They had the technology, the knowledge, and the will to challenge the Galactic Council. But their first victory was just that, a first step. The Council, though unaware of the breakthrough, would not remain blind forever. And when they did discover what had happened, they would come with all the might of their ancient power to crush humanity once again. In the heart of the Resistance's operations, deep beneath the surface of Earth's moon, General Lavra Harding stood before a vast holographic map, her fingers hovering over the display, tracing the locations of human colonies that had begun to sprout like seeds in a barren field. Earth was still humanity's home, but it was also a prison. The shadow of the Council's barrier loomed over the planet, an ever-present reminder of how fragile their freedom truly was. "General," a voice called out, breaking the silence. It was Captain Daniel Frost, just returned from his first phase shift test flight. His face was still lined with the tension of the mission, his eyes carrying the same weight as everyone else. In the room. "You did good work, Frost," Lavra said, her voice a mix of appreciation and pragmatism. "But we can't afford to be complacent. The Council will find out what happened sooner or later." And when they do, they'll come for us with everything they have. Daniel nodded. I know. We need to move fast. I didn't feel anything when we jumped back through the barrier. No alarms, no sign of detection. But we're not out of the woods yet. Laura's eyes narrowed. Agreed. We've made our move, and now we have to keep making them. We can't wait for them to act first. The resistance was growing. While the phase shift drive had been a breakthrough, it was not the only thing that had begun to shift the tides in humanity's favor. Across the galaxy, other species had begun to take notice of the mysterious humans who had suddenly appeared outside their prison, slipping through the energy barriers without a trace. The first whispers of humanity's rise were starting to spread like ripples across an ocean, faint but undeniable dot in secret research labs hidden beneath the surface of Earth's moon. Professor Frank Nichols and his team worked day and night to refine the phase shift drive. They weren't just focusing on propulsion. They were studying alien technology that had been collected during the earlier days of their covert expansion. They needed more than just stealth. They needed an edge that would allow them to strike before the Council could even respond. How's the prototype coming along? Daniel asked, walking into the lab where Frank was hunched over a display screen, running calculations. We're getting closer, Frank replied, wiping sweat from his brow. The drive itself is stable. But we need more than just a few ships. We need a fleet. And a fleet needs resources. We'll need to establish hidden outposts, secure supply lines, and start gathering information on Council movements before we can do anything on a large scale. Daniel watched as Frank worked. The man had aged since they'd started this journey, his once dark hair now speckled with gray, his face drawn and weary. But his eyes burned with the same fire they had the day he'd started this research. He was driven by something deeper than just survival. He was driven by a vision of a future where humanity was no longer confined to a single planet, a vision of freedom and power that had once seemed impossible. How long until we can begin? Daniel asked, his voice serious. The Council can't be allowed to know what we're doing for much longer. The sooner we act, the better. Frank paused, his fingers hovering over the screen as if unsure whether to commit to the numbers that danced before him. I estimate it'll take another 3 months, maybe 4, before we can build the first fleet. But even then, we'll have to keep it small. Stealth is the key. We can't afford to be detected. Lavra joined them in the lab, her eyes sharp and calculating. What's the plan? She asked. We move fast, Frank replied, his voice determined. A first fleet will go beyond the barrier. We'll establish hidden outposts on planets that the Council has ignored. And while we're doing that, we start building the rest of our ships. The Council will have no idea what's coming until it's too late. Lavra crossed her arms, surveying the room. And once we've established a foothold, what then? Frank met her gaze. Then we go on the offensive. We gather intelligence, we cripple their supply lines, and we make them doubt their power. And when they finally come for us, we'll be ready. It was a daring plan, one that would put everything on the line. But humanity had always been a species that took risks. It was in their blood, in their history. The desire to push forward, to explore, to defy the odds, it was what had driven them to the stars in the first place. As Frank and Lara discussed the details of the plan, Daniel's mind wandered. They were still in the early stages, still facing the enormity of what lay ahead. But for the first time in a long while, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel before: hope. They were fighting for something greater than themselves. They were fighting for humanity's place in the galaxy. I'll prepare the fleet, Daniel said, his voice filled with quiet resolve. We'll start building. And when the time comes, we'll make sure the Council knows exactly who they're dealing with. The next few months passed in a blur of construction, research, and quiet preparation. Human ingenuity, once suppressed by the Council's iron grip, began to shine once again. Stealth ships designed to phase in and out of space, weapon systems powered by precursor technology, and fleets of exploratory vessels built in secret began to take shape. Humanity was no longer a prisoner. They were a force in the making. And the galaxy would soon learn just how dangerous they had become. In the darkness of space, where the Council's ships patrolled the void, the first human fleet emerged from the shadows. The Shadow Empire was born. The Shadow Empire was born in silence. A fleet of small, stealthy ships moving through the vastness of space like ghosts, unseen and undetected by the Council's ever-watchful eyes. These ships, powered by the newly perfected phase shift drive, were humanity's first line of offense. They had become shadows in the night, fading in and out of existence, slipping through the Council's defenses with ease. Captain Daniel Frost stood at the command console of the lead ship, Shadow's Edge, his fingers brushing the controls. As he watched the empty space around him, the stars outside seemed distant and unreachable, but in the vast void of space, he was becoming acutely aware of how close they were to something much bigger than themselves. They weren't just escaping. Anymore, they were preparing to strike. The fleet had traveled far beyond the barrier that had once confined Earth. The first objective was simple: find and secure resources. They had to be self-sufficient before they could launch anything more significant. The planets they had chosen for the first phase were barely on the Council's radar remote, undeveloped worlds that could serve as hidden outposts where they could build and prepare for the next stage of their plan. The Council had long ignored these planets, considering them insignificant, and it was there that humanity would find its foothold. "We've arrived at the first target." Daniel's voice was steady as he spoke over the comms, addressing the rest of the fleet. "I want full scans of the surface. We need to make sure there are no surprises waiting for us. And remember, stealth is our greatest weapon." The fleet split into smaller formations, each ship gliding toward a different part of the planet's surface. As they moved closer, Daniel's mind raced with possibilities. This was the beginning of something enormous. They were no longer hiding in the shadows. They were preparing to strike. On the surface, the outposts would begin, and from there, they would expand. As his ship entered the atmosphere of the planet, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling of unease that gripped him. Everything they had done, all the work that had gone into getting them this far, had led to this moment. The future of humanity was no longer in the hands of the Galactic Council or the leaders of Earth. It was in their own hands, for better or worse. And no matter what happened next, there was no turning back. Back on Earth, the political leaders were still reeling from the decision to imprison humanity. Though they had been given the promise of eventual freedom, they knew deep down that the time for diplomacy was long past. Humanity had no intention of staying under the Council's thumb. No more negotiations, no more compromises. Their survival depended on action. Professor Frank Nichols was busy overseeing the development of new technology, refining the phase shift drive for larger ships, and exploring the deeper secrets of the precursor data they had uncovered. His lab, located beneath the surface of the moon, had become a hub of activity. Engineers worked alongside scientists to build everything humanity would need for the upcoming confrontation. The precursor technology they had uncovered was being reverse-engineered, unlocking new weapons, shields, and propulsion systems that would put them on par with, and eventually surpass the Council's most advanced ships. The time had come to move from stealth to warfare. As the Shadow Empire expanded, the leaders of the Galactic Council began to notice something unusual. There were small anomalies in the galactic system. Ships that had once been confined to Earth's solar system were now slipping through the Council's carefully monitored barriers. Sensors picked up strange energy signatures, and reports of unidentifiable ships began trickling in from distant sectors. The Council's intelligence was scrambling to make sense of it all. The first whispers of rebellion began to echo across the galaxy. For the Council, it was a matter of pride. How could this happen? How had humanity, a species once confined to a single planet, managed to break free and grow without their notice? The Zarians, with their centuries of rule over the galaxy, felt a gnawing sense of insecurity. How had they overlooked this? How had they miscalculated the potential of a species they had dismissed as chaotic and uncontrollable? High Chancellor Vortic, who had once dismissed humanity as little more than a passing nuisance, found himself in heated debates with the Council. This cannot be happening. We've controlled the galaxy for millennia. We can't let this threat continue to grow. They're a destabilizing force. The Council was divided. While some representatives pushed for more aggressive military action, others cautioned against underestimating the newly formed Shadow Empire. Humanity had shown its resolve and resourcefulness, and it was only a matter of time before they would grow too strong to ignore. Meanwhile, on the edge of human-controlled space, the Shadow Empire continued to expand quietly. A dozen outposts had been established in just a few months, each one hidden from the Council's view. The ships that passed through the galaxy, whether they were reconnaissance vessels or trade ships, were able to relay data back to Earth without detection, providing vital information on Council movements and weaknesses. But even as they celebrated small victories, the Resistance knew that it was only a matter of time before the Council realized they were not alone in the galaxy. And when that happened, they would come for humanity with everything they had. The first wave of the Council's response was already in the making, a massive fleet, armed to the teeth and ready to crush the upstart rebellion. Captain Daniel Frost, leading a reconnaissance mission on a newly discovered world, watched the stars ahead with a mix of determination and uncertainty. Their time was running out. The fleet was still small, its strength still untested. They had to act now, or they might never get another chance. "We've found it," came the voice of Karen Martinez, his sensor officer, breaking through his thoughts. "A Council fleet is moving into position. They're not expecting us, but they'll be within range in 2 days." Daniel's mind clicked into gear. 2 days. They had 2 days to strike, to make their move before the Council could turn their attention toward their hidden outposts. He spoke quickly, his voice steady, but beneath it was the fire of someone who knew they couldn't afford to lose this opportunity. "Prepare for battle," he ordered. "All ships engage the fleet on my mark. We don't give them a chance to regroup." He turned to his crew, the weight of the moment hanging over them all. Humanity's future is on the line. Let's make sure the Council knows who they're dealing with. With those words, the first real confrontation between the Shadow Empire and the Galactic Council began to take shape. The battle would be fought not just with weapons, but with strategy and cunning. The Council might have the numbers, but humanity had the advantage of surprise, and surprise would be their weapon of choice. As Daniel's fleet prepared for battle, they knew that this would be their most dangerous and defining moment. The Shadow Empire was not just surviving anymore. They were preparing to make their mark on the galaxy. The days following Daniel Frost's battle with the Council's fleet were a whirlwind of tension and strategy. The first skirmish had been a surprise for both sides, but it was only the beginning. While the Shadow Empire's victory was an undeniable triumph, it had also confirmed a hard truth. This was no longer just a matter of survival. This was war. The Council's retaliatory measures would come swiftly and with brutal force. Humanity's insurrection had been exposed, and the Council would not allow it to stand. They had underestimated humanity's resolve, and now they were. Angry, on the command bridge of the Shadow's Edge, Daniel stared at the tactical map in front of him, his mind racing with the events that had unfolded in the past few days. The Council fleet had been scattered, its command structure crippled by surprise attacks from human vessels equipped with precursor technology. But it hadn't been enough to break them completely. The Council had vast resources, and they would rally quickly. Their next move would be calculated, deliberate, and devastating. "Admiral Pierce," Daniel said, his voice cutting through the quiet hum of the bridge. "What's the status on the other fleets?" Admiral Julia Pierce, a seasoned veteran of war, stood beside him, her arms crossed as she scanned the reports. Her face was stern, but there was a flicker of admiration in her eyes. Humanity had surprised even her, and she had seen it all the best and the worst of every conflict the galaxy had to offer. "We've secured 3 of the key outposts," Pierce replied, her tone steady. "But we're seeing increased council patrols near the outer rim. They're not just hunting for us anymore. They're hunting for all our allies. The Nelver, the Krell, they're at risk, Daniel." Daniel clenched his fists. The Shadow Empire wasn't just about survival. It was about liberation. They had promised to fight for the freedom of those who had suffered under the Council's oppressive reign. Now, they had to honor that promise. The galaxy was a massive place, and humanity wasn't going to stand alone. If the Council crushed their allies, they would crush the entire resistance, no matter how many ships they had or how many secret outposts they controlled. "We can't let them fall," Daniel said, his voice sharp. "We need to send reinforcements, all ships available." "But we're outnumbered," Pierce countered. "The Council has assembled a fleet and armada, if you will, and they're coming for us with everything they have. We won't be able to hold them off indefinitely. Our fleet is still small, and the technology we have is untested on such a scale." Daniel turned to face her, his eyes narrowing with determination. "Then we fight differently. We don't need numbers. We need strategy. We know the Council's weaknesses. We can outmaneuver them." Pierce regarded him for a moment, studying his face as if searching for any hint of doubt. But there was none. Daniel was the kind of leader who inspired loyalty, even in the direst of circumstances. She nodded slowly. "All right. Let's show them what humanity is capable of," she said, turning to her officers. "Prepare the fleet. We'll engage on our terms." The battle that awaited them was one that neither side had truly expected. The Council's fleets were vast, but humanity's strength lay in their unpredictability, their ability to think outside the box. The Shadow Empire had always been a hidden force, working from the shadows. Now they would turn the table. As the fleet mobilized, Daniel joined Frank Nichols in the ship's laboratory. Frank had been working around the clock, using every scrap of precursor technology to enhance their ships, their shields, and their weapons. Frank's eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep, but there was a gleam in them, an excitement that hadn't been there before. "You've got a plan, don't you?" Daniel asked, his voice quiet. "I always have a plan," Frank replied, cracking a tired smile. "But this one's a little unconventional. I've been working on a new system, a method of cloaking. Not just visually, but energetically. If we can make our ships completely undetectable, we can move through Council space without leaving a trace. It's risky, but it's our best shot at catching them off guard." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "You think it'll work?" Frank hesitated. "I think it's our only chance." The plan was simple, yet audacious. The fleet would divide into smaller, stealthier units, using cloaking technology to infiltrate the Council's lines. They would strike quickly, hitting key Council vessels before they even realized what was happening. The goal was not to engage in a full-scale battle, but to disrupt the Council's supply chains and force them to spread their forces thin. It was a strategy of attrition, hitting them where it hurt the most, their logistics. The fleet moved into position, and as they neared Council territory, the tension in the air was palpable. This wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. This was about sending a message to the galaxy. Humanity would no longer be confined. They would fight for their place among the stars. "Status report," Daniel called, his voice calm but sharp. "All ships in position," Pierce responded. "Cloaking systems are online and operational. We're ready." Daniel nodded, his gaze fixed on the stars ahead. "Let's do it." The battle began without warning. The fleet emerged from the darkness, like shadows themselves, slipping past the Council's sensors and into their ranks. Within minutes, chaos erupted in the Council's fleet. Vessels that had once seemed indestructible were suddenly vulnerable, their systems failing as cloaked human ships disabled their engines and shields. "We're hitting them where they least expected," Pierce reported, her voice laced with satisfaction. "They're confused. Their lines are breaking." The Council's response was swift, but it came too late. The humans had already inflicted enough damage. The Shadow Empire wasn't fighting like the Council expected. They weren't engaging in direct combat. They were dismantling the Council's operations, one strike at a time. And with each successful attack, their enemies were growing more paranoid, more desperate. Back on Shadow's Edge, Daniel stood at the command console, watching as the battle unfolded. It was like a dance, a well-choreographed series of strikes and retreats. Each time the Council attempted to retaliate, the human fleet was already gone, slipping back into the darkness. "This is just the beginning," Daniel muttered to himself. He had no illusions. The Council would regroup. They would adapt. But for the first time, humanity had shown the galaxy that they were not to be underestimated. The first confrontation was over, but the war had only just begun. The victory against the Council's fleet was a fleeting one, as brief as a spark in the dark void of space. But it was a spark that would ignite something far greater. The Shadow Empire, though still in its infancy, had delivered its first blow against the Council's long-standing dominance. The Council, once confident and secure in its absolute control, now faced a challenge it hadn't anticipated: humanity. But as the fleet returned to their hidden bases, a sense of unease began to settle over the leaders of the Shadow Empire. The Council, though shocked, was far from broken. In fact, it was clear they would respond with all the might at their disposal. Humanity's attack, though a victory, had drawn a line in the sand. Now, the real war was about to begin. Captain Daniel Frost stood at the window of the Shadows Edge, staring out at the endless expanse of space. His reflection flickered in the glass-tired, resolute, but also haunted by the weight of what they had started. His mind was racing, piecing together the fragments of the battle they had just fought and the battle yet to come. "We've made a mark on the galaxy," he muttered to himself, "but the Council will not forget this. They will come for us. And when they do, we need to be ready." Beside him, Admiral Julia Pierce watched the same stars, her face a study in concentration. She had led human fleets before, but never in a conflict like this. The Council's military might was unprecedented, and their resources vast. Humanity had no illusions about their position. They had surprised the Council once, but how long? Could that last? "We need to know what we're up against," Pierce said, her voice low but firm. "The Council will consolidate their forces. They'll come for us with everything they have. We need to hit them before they can regroup." Daniel turned to her, his jaw tightening. "We can't fight them head-on, not yet. We don't have the numbers, and we don't have the resources. But we do have something they don't: the element of surprise." He looked over at Frank Nichols, who had been in the lab for days, his face pale from lack of sleep, but his eyes burning with the fire of someone who knew their very survival depended on the next step. "Professor," Daniel called, his voice carrying a sense of urgency. Frank looked up from his station, his face haggard but determined. "What is it?" "We need to know what the Council is planning. We've hit them once, but we've made enemies in the process. I want every scrap of intel we can get. If the Council is as big as they say they are, they'll have spies, recon ships, and intelligence assets we need to track. Frank's fingers moved rapidly over the console. I can tap into their communications network. We've been using secure channels to avoid detection, but I might be able to decrypt some of their comms. It'll take time, but we'll get something. Make it happen, Daniel said, turning back to the stars outside. We need to know where they're going next. Days passed as Frank worked tirelessly, decoding encrypted messages and tracking Council movements. Each moment of silence was thick with the tension of waiting for their next move. The fleet was spread thin, their resources stretched to the limit, but the progress was undeniable. The phase shift drive was refined. New ships were being built in secret, and their reach was expanding. Then, the first significant break came. Frank burst into the command room, his face illuminated by the glow of his tablet. I've got something. Everyone gathered around him as he pulled up a decrypted transmission. It was a report from a Council intelligence officer, one of the many who had been placed in key systems for surveillance. The report outlined a military mobilization on a scale not seen in centuries. The Council was assembling their fleets, preparing for a strike against the growing human resistance. They know, Frank said grimly. They're not just going after us. They're going after everyone we've allied with. The Nelver, the Krell, and others. They're planning a purge. Daniel clenched his fists. We can't let that happen. Admiral Pierce stepped forward, her voice calm but filled with authority. We need to strike first. We can't wait for them to come to us. If we let them attack our allies, we lose everything. We have to hit them where it hurts most to disable. Their fleets cripple their command structure and send a message that we're not afraid. Daniel nodded. Agreed, but this time we need to be more strategic. We know the Council's patterns, their weaknesses. We hit their supply lines, their infrastructure. We make them bleed without giving them the chance to retaliate. The plan was set in motion quickly. Frank and his team worked with their best engineers and strategists to refine the assault. The Shadow Empire would deploy a series of stealth attacks on Council supply depots and key military installations. They would use their cloaking technology and phase shift drives to move in undetected, strike hard, and vanish before the Council could even react. Days before the operation was to begin. Daniel sat alone in the command room, reflecting on the enormity of what lay ahead. The stakes were higher than ever. Every decision, every move could mean the difference between victory and destruction. You're thinking about the future again, a voice said, interrupting his thoughts. It was Olivia Mason, the diplomat who had been by his side since the beginning. Her expression was pensive, but there was a warmth in her eyes, an unspoken understanding. Between them, Daniel looked up at her. I don't know what the future holds. I just know that if we don't act now, if we don't take the Council down before they have the chance to crush us, we'll lose everything. The galaxy won't be free. Not for a long time, Olivia nodded. You're right. But we've come this far, Daniel. We've already proven that we can make the impossible happen. The future is ours to shape. Daniel's heart swelled with a rare sense of hope, though it was fleeting. He knew the battle would be fierce. They would be fighting not just for their freedom, but for the freedom of every species the Council had oppressed. And even if they lost everything in the end, they had already done what many thought impossible. He stood up from his seat, his resolve hardening. Let's show them what humanity can do. The fleet moved out. For the first time in history, humanity wasn't just fighting for survival. They were fighting for the right to shape their destiny, and the Council would never see it coming.